Welcome to Solutions Rising. I'm Rachel Branch, and I am very pleased to welcome Mr. David Detmold to Solutions Rising. For years, Mr. Detmold has been instrumental in fighting to change the racist flag and seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we hope our program will encourage you to show support for this necessary change. But also, it is very important for us to discuss pending bills in our Commonwealth legislature that must be passed as another step to stopping the unending disrespect, mistreatment, and atrocious acts against the Native peoples across Massachusetts. Welcome, Mr. Detmold. David, if I may.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Would you please share whatever you would like about your background and your heritage?
Sure. I'm German-Irish. And no native blood to my knowledge, but I've been fortunate to have been around Indigenous people just about all my life. When I was young and growing up in New London, Connecticut, my family welcomed an Onondaga woman into our household who was a Vista volunteer trainee, and she taught me an awful lot when I was 12 or 13. And subsequently, I followed her out to the University of Omaha, Nebraska, where she taught, and she introduced me to powwows and many Native people in that region, and it's just been a subject of interest and advocacy for me ever since I was a young boy, and to do whatever I can to help when Indigenous leaders, wherever they may live, call on allies to help either legislative struggles or whatever the topic may be. I'm always there. Yep.
It's wonderful.
Yep.
And of course, I use the term these days for acculturation. I think most of us Americans need to be acculturated. Mm-hmm. And I remember 1974 writing a speech for the first black mayor of Boulder, Colorado, mm-hmm. and I said, we are not a melting pot. We are strong because of the diversity mm-hmm. of our cultures. Mm-hmm. And that is really important. And as Americans, that's supposed to be what we're all about. Mm-hmm. And just before we started taping this program, I told you a little bit about, I'm a direct descendant of Captain John Gallup, who landed here in 1630 on Native people's land. And I did not learn until the early 2000s that they had committed, my ancestors had committed genocide and atrocities on the Native peoples and enslaved people. And I speak about it, which I'm doing again today. Mm-hmm. I speak about it mm-hmm. as much as possible, because we will not heal as a country if we do not tell the truth yes. about our heritage and the beauty of all the cultures in our country that are the strength of what we're supposed to be if we become a democracy, but which I'm still hoping for.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll just add that I mentioned I grew up in New London, right across the Thames River from Mystic, mm-hmm. and never knew of the terrible slaughter that occurred there in 1636, yep. when the Massachusetts Bay Colony that you just mentioned, your
my ancestor
was part of the original sailing over from England to Shawmut Bay, now called Boston Harbor. Mm-hmm. And 6 years after that, they sent an expeditionary force down to what was then just the very beginning of the colony of mm-hmm. Connecticut, and surrounded a palisaded village of the Pequot Nation and burned alive up to 400 Pequot men, women, and children. And this happened right across from where I grew up, where my mother lived for the last several decades of her life. She lived within a quarter mile of this terrible massacre site, and none of us ever knew about it. There's not even a marker there to say this is where that terrible event took place. So we discover these terrible truths of our history as we listen to the Native people who are teaching us about the traumatic stories that they bear within their culture, and we need to reckon with all of that. And the symbols that we maintain of our victory, so-called, in the conquest of these lands, the military conquest. And this flag and seal I regard as a symbol of that genocide that occurred, or the attempted genocide that occurred. Of course, Native nations are strong and resilient, and Native people are living on this land as they always have. And they look at the colonial settlers as newcomers who have really
decimated
and really done a great deal of destruction, not just to the people who welcomed them here when the Pilgrims first arrived in that first winter of starvation in 1620, but also to the land itself. Look at what environmental catastrophes we have been dealing with, things that Native people would never have allowed to occur, such as this train wreck in Ohio just a few weeks ago with toxic chemicals being released into the environment. And that's just the latest in a long, long series of environmental disasters that have occurred at our hands. So, you know, we have a lot to learn from Native people who have lived on this continent, continue to live on this continent for the past 10,000 years.
The respect for the land.
That's right.
The gratitude, the appreciation, and the connection. But I'm going to back up just a little bit and say Gallup's Island in Boston Harbor is named after Captain John Gallup. I think this was given by Governor Winthrop, and that's why I brought this book with me, Ten Hills Farm, which tells quite a story. This is by Catherine S. Manigault, incredible writer, and I've met her and learned a great deal from this book. But I also found out, because you came from Connecticut, Ledyard is where there's a Gallup Family Association, and I went, and somebody sent me to the Historical Society, and I opened up, 7 families, and there's the Gallups, and talking about what happens to the slaves,
And when we're talking slaves, we're talking not just African American slaves, but indigenous people.
And I didn't know that either.
Enslaved in the Northeast, and also taken as captives and shipped to the rum plantations in the Caribbean islands, where the work was so terribly arduous that apparently a quarter of the people died every year who were shipped into slavery there, Native people. So
this is horrific history, and I'm so glad that you and I are talking about this as another way to start continuing the truth-telling in this country.
Have to tell the truth, and then once you acknowledge the history, I think it's incumbent upon us all to think about reparations for the harm that has been done. So we can talk about that a little later.
It's another conversation. I think people, from my point of view, can do the while you're waiting for legislation, you can do reparations today by helping other people, and where in your local communities or in the Commonwealth where you can contribute reparations. You don't have to call it that, but. You can call it that also.
Sure.
So let's get to the flag, which is also depicted all over the Commonwealth, and we'll start talking right here. How did you become involved in this fight for the flag?
Well, just
to change our racist flag and seal.
Well, just briefly, I live now in Montague, on the other side of the mountains, and in the Connecticut Valley. And when I was working there in town government, I was on the town meeting in Montague for many, many years. It's an elected position. I was also the founding editor of a weekly newspaper that covers Montague and 4 of the surrounding communities, called the Montague Reporter. So that gives you a little context about who I am over there in Franklin County on the other side of the ridge. But as the editor of the paper, I could not fail to notice that the village that I live in is named after a man named Captain William Turner, who led a massacre of Native people who had been sheltering there as refugees from the ongoing warfare that we call King Philip's War in 1675 and 1676. Captain Turner came out from Boston, raised a militia in Hadley, and attacked this refugee village in the dawn of May 19th, 1676, and wiped them out. There was a counterattack. He was killed on the retreat, but the early morning attack was really just firing at people who were sleeping, and these were the old men, women, and children who had tried to escape the warfare. So they named our village after Turner. They named our high school after Turner, Turner's High School, and they named the high school mascot the Indians. And so it's such an egregious insult, first of all, to appropriate Native imagery, and we used a Plains Indian headdress for our school mascot, but to call a sports team the Indians in a town named after the man who killed every Native American indigenous person he could find that morning, it's just the height of insult. So I worked with indigenous activists and other locals who were concerned, and we changed that mascot. And that was a difficult thing to do. As people who have attempted that in school districts all around the Commonwealth can tell you, it's a hard thing for a school committee, even though Native mascots are clearly stereotyping one race and discriminating against all people of color, and really teaching a bad thing even to people of the mainstream white society, that you can take these symbols and pretend that you can paint your face blue with war paint, so-called, and pretend you are an Indian. Well, this is highly, highly insulting and creates an unlevel educational playing field. There should be no more Native mascots used throughout the Commonwealth. And one of the bills we'll talk about—
And the United States.
Anywhere. And one of the bills we're going to talk about is a statewide ban on the use of Native mascots. My point was to be that in the middle of that heated discussion with the school committee, a man stood up in the back of one of those hearings and said, if we have to change our school mascot, why shouldn't the state have to change their mascot? And we opened up the flag on the school auditorium stage, and we all took a good look at it. A white hand holding a sword over the head of a Native American, an indigenous person, and the Latin phrase, peace under the sword, but peace with liberty. Well, I thought the man's got a good point, and I've been working to change it ever since.
So that's how that happened. How many years have this?
It's been 6 years now.
Yeah.
And we started by organizing town meetings in some of the little towns around Montague: Gill, Wendell, New Salem, and Orange. Orange, which had voted in the majority for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton just 2 years earlier, voted to change the Massachusetts flag and seal in 2018 with those other 3 towns I mentioned. These are not liberal bastions. You couldn't call them Cambridge or Provincetown. These are just heartland communities where people looked at this flag and said, this really is a war trophy and a symbol of ancient genocide, and does not represent the highest ideals of the Commonwealth. It's not something we should be continuing to teach our children. And they voted to change it. And after those first 4 towns in 2018 said that, we have now added 52 other cities and towns, from Great Barrington all the way to Provincetown, and everywhere in between. And we hope very much that as a result of this program, which you're so kindly inviting me to, that people will be inspired to bring this up at their town meetings here in the spring in Cheshire or in
North Adams, Clarksburg, Florida, and Williamstown.
Thank you so
There's
much.
no reason why
That's
they
right.
should not bring it up, and
Thank
we'll
you.
make some contacts after the program. But I did, and I don't think I've ever known, you know, the symbol of the arrow coming down is hoping for peace.
Yeah.
If you would you tell
sure.
the points, and then we'll go into the bills.
You mentioned that one of your ancestors came over with the Puritans. They brought this image with them in a slightly different form, but their first seal from 1629 was a native person, as they imagined him, with one downward arrow, no quiver on his shoulder. In other words, a pacified Indian, not ready for battle, but if it was a warrior or a soldier ready for battle, there'd be a quiver full of arrows. But no, only one downward pointed arrow. And here now, 390 some odd years later, almost 400 years later, we're still looking at that same symbol. I would say just a few other quick things. When they came up with this final design and codified it in 1890, so we've been looking at this exact artistic rendering of the flag and seal ever since 1890, they chose the facial features of a Native American chief from Montana and said, this is an ideal specimen of an Indian and not from Massachusetts. They chose the bow from a native person who was shot and killed by a settler in Sudbury. The settler's name, we remember, was William Goodnow, and it was in 1665 that native person was shot and killed. That's his bow. We don't remember the name of the native person, unfortunately, lost to history. And the belt was modeled after the belt worn by Metacom, who we call King Philip, and the sword in particular.
Who my ancestors killed.
I'm so sorry to hear
My
that.
Gallup ancestors killed.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yes.
And finally, I would say that the sword, the Secretary of State at the time was named William Olin, and he directed that the sword should be a direct copy of the broadsword that was kept in the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth and known to be the sword used by Miles Standish. So Native people remember Miles Standish, the military commander for the Pilgrims, for ambushing and killing Native people with this sword. And this is truly offensive to Indigenous people. They have been calling for it to be revised and changed, retire this symbol for more than 50 years. And recently, the former governor, Charlie Baker, set up a special commission with the full support of the legislature to recommend changes to this flag, and finally, for the first time, invited 6 Indigenous leaders from the area we call the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and to sit with state legislators and look at this and recommend revisions. And that special commission worked for the past year, and in December, just 2 months ago, issued a unanimous finding that this flag and seal are harmful and need to be totally revised. So that's where we stand today.
And it's taking way too long.
It's been 40 years in front of the legislature.
I mean, yes.
Yeah.
And that's that pushback against truth-telling and correcting atrocious symbols.
Yeah.
I did find out that the white star is supposed to signify that Massachusetts was the 6th,
One of the first colonies.
yes,
And
to be admitted to the United States. Like, oh, really? Okay.
I have no problem with the star. Everything else, I would say, let's revise it. It's a warlike
It is a
symbol.
warlike advertisement, is really what it is.
It really
to
is.
kill
Yep.
the people who own the land, or whose land belonged to them in this country. I'll take out the owned.
Yep.
Land belongs to.
You're right.
Yeah. So
And we used to say up until 2 years ago that Mississippi and Massachusetts were in a race to the bottom to see who would hold on to the flag of white supremacy the longest. Mississippi's state flag was the last with the Confederate stars and bars. But after the murder of George Floyd, Mississippi, although they had resisted for 20 years an effort to change their state flag, they retired it. And they retired it by an executive order of the governor. And he said, we're taking it down. You'll come up with a new design soon enough. So for 3 months in 2020, they didn't have a state flag. And Maura Healey, you should take a tip from Mississippi, because Massachusetts
and the
won that
Berkshire
race.
delegation, I don't think any
Right.
of them have come in and supported this. And of course, they will hear about it on this
Not s-
program.
Not as strongly as we would hope they would. We would
don't-
hope they would. They voted for setting up the commission. Now they've heard from the commission. Now it's time for action.
And of course, the action comes from people on the local level and across the Commonwealth saying, do this.
Please.
This needs to be done.
Please,
This
anybody
is part
who's
of your elective duty to correct.
Anybody who's listening to this program, please contact Representative John Barrett and Senator Paul Mark and say, we're tired of waiting. We don't want to teach this to our children anymore. We don't want to wave this flag in our school auditoriums and our town halls. Take it down, come up with a new design.
Well, hopefully they will respond.
I hope so.
We'll have to push
We
from
do.
locally.
We do.
Anyway, so I think we need to talk about, there are 5 resolutions for bills coming up, and I think we ought to talk about those.
Sure.
And
And these are bills that are pending now, and they've been reintroduced, unfortunately, because although they made a lot of progress last session at the legislature has not acted and passed these bills into law. Although our neighboring states of Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut, Rhode Island are really showing us the way. And I first have to say that these bills are all backed by the Mass Indigenous Legislative Agenda, and that website you could go to and you can fill out a simple take action letter under their take action page. Takes less than 5 minutes, and it goes right to your state senator and state representative. I can't speak for the Mass Indigenous Legislative Agenda. I can only speak in total support of their work.
And that website is also not on our screen now, but it will be on. We've got Change the Mass Flag, but there's another website that will be showing. It's Mass Indigenous Agenda.
Mass Indigenous Legislative Agenda.
Yeah,
and that's
that
how
will
you
be,
find it.
there it is on our screen. MaineIndigenousAgenda.org.
MA, Indigenous.
Oh, I have M-A-I. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I've made a mistake on that.
No. You've got it, because it's MA, the first two letters of Massachusetts, and then Indigenous Legislative.
Yes, but I have an extra I-N in there,
Okay.
so we'll have to
right.
take that out.
All right. Well, people will find their way to it, massindigenousagenda.org.
Yep.
And the 5 bills, and I'll summarize them very briefly. The first one, and the one that is, from my to my knowledge, the most important to Native activists across the Commonwealth, is the one that would ban the use of Native mascots in school sports teams. And I would say that almost all of the ones in Western Mass, all the school districts that carried these mascots have done this hard work, except I'm afraid for Dalton. I don't think Dalton has made that change. But as usual, Western Mass is leading the way and showing the rest of the Commonwealth what needs to be done, and we do need a statewide bill, just like Maine passed several years ago. So that's the first one. More than a quarter of the state legislature co-sponsored it last session, and still we couldn't get it done. So we really need John Barrett, Representative Barrett, and Senator Mark to get active on this and help pass what is called Prohibiting Native Mascots in Massachusetts, and the bill numbers are there. Establishing a statewide Indigenous Peoples Day is one of the other bills backed by the Mass Indigenous Agenda, and that would replace the holiday we now call Columbus in Massachusetts, Columbus Day, second Monday in October, with Indigenous Peoples Day, the way many other states and many cities and towns across the Commonwealth have already done. We should not be teaching our children to honor the slave trader and kidnapper who is Christopher Columbus. We should bring Indigenous people into our schools and into our town squares to celebrate their culture and on that day, and not Christopher Columbus. We have to replace that holiday. So the other 3, one of them is to prevent the private sale of Indigenous artifacts. It's just a very common sense bill. And the other 2 revolve around teaching Native American culture and history at all appropriate grade levels, and improving educational outcomes for Indigenous people. So these 5 bills together are the package of legislation that is backed by the Mass Indigenous Agenda and needs our active support.
It's wonderful.
Thank you.
It's really wonderful, and we will do everything we can to push the bills, and obviously our program.
Yep.
We're on 15 stations, although 12 are in the Commonwealth, and then the link that you will get, and everybody we send the link to can send it to anybody else.
Right,
you
they
can
can
send it
share
to
it.
anybody and everybody you want, and then of course we could go to webcast.nbctc.org. Solutions Rising is shown on that. So we have a lot of ways to get this information out, David.
That's great, Rachel.
So we're getting close to the end. Do you have a final thought or comment? And I must say thank you very much for being a guest on Solutions Rising.
It's totally my pleasure. I would encourage people, if any questions have arisen from what you've just heard today, to contact. I'd be happy to answer any questions I can. Contact me through changethemassflag.com. That's the website I coordinate, changethemassflag.com. If you would like to help bring the resolution to change this symbol for a more harmonious state flag and seal to your town meeting, please get in touch, and I'll come over and help you gather the signatures you need to get it on the warrant, and to pass around these informational flyers to folks who are coming to your town meeting, so they can take a good hard look at this. And when you look at it, it really is a shameful symbol, and we can do so much better to represent the highest ideals of the Commonwealth and peace and harmony and justice for all the people who live in the Commonwealth today.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Yep.
And perhaps I can get some of those yellow statements to hand out.
I will. I'll give them to you.
Okay, I'll take a little supply. I think everybody can do something, and at the end of each show I say my signature line. If each one of us pick up one problem and solve it, imagine the incredible view we would all have of solutions rising. Each one of us has a gift. You know how to use your gift. Certainly this is very easy to participate. Either pick up the phone or call your legislature. And this program is also about calling your legislator all across the Commonwealth. And when we find out, is there a new commission? Not yet?
Not yet. It's a little bit, we're waiting to see how things will shape up with that, but we have to keep the pressure on the legislature.
Yep. So anybody you know, any way you can help, please do. Thank you very much, David Detmold, for being a guest on Solutions Rising. And this is a to-be continued action. This is what I might call a revolution of hope and action. The action is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Great.